Welcome to Make Me Data Literate, the podcast that makes data intelligible from the Australian Data Science Education Institute. We're on a mission to make the whole world data literate. I'm your host, Dr. Linda McIver, and every week I'll interview someone with a wild and wonderful relationship to data. Let's see what we can find out. Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Me Data Literate. I am very excited today to have a guest on a subject that I am woefully ignorant of. And in fact, most of what I know, I learned from him. So thank you so much for coming, Richard Dennis.
Thanks for having me on, Linda. Really excited to be here.
Awesome. Can you tell us who you are and what you do?
Dr. Richard Dennis, Executive Director of the Australia Institute, a think tank based in Canberra. I'm an escapee from academia, former political advisor, and working at a think tank allows me to still be an active researcher, but do so in a way that's designed to influence not just the public debate, but public policy, bringing evidence to bear on important decisions.
That's quite the background. I'm also an escapee from academia. I tend to use the term reformed academic.
Escaped. I just escaped.
You haven't reformed then?
Nah.
Good to know. I was really struck. So I attended the Australia Institute economics classes that you had, the webinars.
Yep.
Sometime in the extended bizarreness of the pandemic, all the lockdowns and things. And one of the things that you said in that, which really stuck in my mind, was economics doesn't tell you to do anything. Like if someone says we have to do this because the economy, they're lying to you. And I love that, most of your public facing work seems to be debunking myths, trying to educate us.
There's a lot of myths out there. And look, the biggest myth is what is economics and what's it for? And of course, the irony that sits at the heart of this is that what we learn in economics, what we teach in economics, is that it's really up to individuals to decide how individuals want to live their life. Most economists, including myself, are broadly libertarian. I don't want to tell you what to have for breakfast. I don't want to tell you what to watch on television. Economists tend to think that individuals are best placed to make decisions for what would make that individual happy. Now, and keep in mind that, Adam Smith, the founder of economics, Wealth of Nations, he was a rebel who was trying to escape feudalism. He lived in a world where kings and barons and dukes told, their indentured labor, who their kids could marry and, what profession they could. So the idea of economics was radical at the time. Like, hang on, what if people could make their own decisions? Now, of course, some people have taken that way too far and said, well, therefore, if individuals are good at deciding what to have for breakfast, we shouldn't ever regulate individual behaviour. Now that's ridiculous. Imagine the roads. If everyone could decide what side of the road to drive on, whether to care about red lights, indeed what was a safe car to have on the road. And of course, guess what? An individual would never be able to build a road. The only reason that there's a road for us to be individualistic on, if we wanted to be, was that we first banded together to work collectively to build a road. So economics calls itself the science of the efficient allocation of resources. It tells itself that we help answer the question of what to produce, when to produce, and for whom to produce. And these are important questions. And I like economics. I'm critical of a lot of what's said, but I like my discipline. But there's nothing in economics that says we shouldn't collect more tax and have a health system as good as the Nordic countries. There's nothing in economics that says that we should cut taxes for high-income earners and spend less on aged care. These are choices. And you can make them and I can make them, and we can make individual choices about what to have for breakfast, or we can club together and vote for a government that says, I'll collect a bit more tax and I'll spend a bit more on roads, or I'll collect a bit less in tax and, we'll have crap hospitals like they do in America. These are still our choices, but there's nothing in the economics textbook that says which of those choices is right or wrong.
I think that's really interesting because it's not the way it's often presented to us. You know, we're presented with really strong statements like, you know, we can't afford this, and that's one of the things about your message that I particularly love. It's like we can afford anything. It's just a choice. It's you know, choosing where we put our resources is up to us. Um, you present economics in a way that I haven't seen. Well, it doesn't seem to be the standard sort of standard message. How did you come to that? Like, did you have to learn different? Was this part of your education, or did you learn things differently somehow?
Look, great question. And look, to be clear, there's just to say a gulf, there's a chasm between what academic economists think and do and teach and what people who listen to breakfast radio or watch the nightly news think economics is. And is that the fault of my discipline? Or is that the fault of the media? Or is it the fault of powerful people who have incredibly effectively co opted my discipline's public appearance? So, yeah, when I go on radio and say, you know, there's nothing in an economics textbook that says we should cut taxes and spend less money on poor people. If I walk onto a university campus and say that, everyone will say, God, you're boring, Richard. You know, but seriously, like, there's nothing shocking about that.
Yeah.
Nothing at all to academic economists who know exactly what I'm saying and why I'm saying it. But we don't talk to academic economists. We ask the Business Council of Australia. We ask the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. We ask, you know, Chris Richardson, you know, or we ask someone who works for a large consulting firm whose clients want a tax cut. And we ask them this weirdest of question of all: what would be good for the economy? Right? Not what would be good for Australia, not what would be good for Australians, what
Yeah.
would be good for the economy. And we're talking about data today. Well, talk about being driven by a misunderstanding of the data. We collect data on something called gross domestic product, GDP, which is a very accurate number, or a very accurate description of something pretty irrelevant, right?
Mm.
The GDP tells us how much stuff got bought and sold in the last 12 months. That's it. And if you wanted to know how much stuff got bought and sold in the last 12 months, I promise you GDP is your go-to number. It's a ripper. Are we going in the right direction? No idea. Are we making people happy? No idea. Do we need more of this or less of this? Don't know. But I can tell you to the decimal place how much got bought and sold. You know, now don't get me wrong, I'd rather have that data than not have it, but
Yeah.
it's in some people's interests to dress, well, let me put it differently. People dress their self-interest up as the national interest by talking about what the economy wants and what the economy needs, when what they meant to say was what they want and they need. So, and in other news, rich person says tax cuts for the rich would be good.
Yeah.
Well, it's not very persuasive, is it? But according to a new analysis released by a very expensive consulting firm, it turns out that if we were to lower taxes for high income earners, it would increase GDP by a record 4.2%. Right? So why would you talk about why Richard wants a tax cut to make Richard happy
Yeah.
when I can dress up Richard wants a tax cut to make poor people have more opportunities?
Yeah, it's I talk in my work about proxy data and about how, you know, the data that you have is often not the data that you actually want, but it's, you know, it's an approximation, and is it close enough for your needs? And and we often forget the risk of proxy data is that we forget that it's not actually what we want to measure. So when we're measuring GDP and using that as the end point, we don't necessarily we forget that actually that's not, you know, GDP doesn't have that much influence on my life and on, you know, on how good my school is, or how good the healthcare is. If I wind up at a public hospital tomorrow, the GDP is not actually what we want to think about if we're thinking about, is this good for Australia in general?
Exactly. But if I'm in the business of selling useless crap that people don't really need,
Yeah.
and, and GDP measures the rate of growth of all the crap we bought and sold last year, you can see why what's a proxy data for you is
Yeah.
core data for me.
Yeah.
Because
It,
if we can cut taxes and people will have more disposable income to spend in department stores,
yeah.
that's good for the person that owns a department store,
Yeah.
but bad for the person that needs healthcare or education. So, for the people dominating our debate who aren't academics about what the economy is and what's good or bad for the economy, yeah, it's not proxy data for them. It's like, could we cut taxes so that people will have more money to spend on the things I get rich selling to them? And, why does my voice sound a little bit different in the debate? Yeah, because I'm not trying to sell people more fridges or televisions. I'm trying to tell them, if you wanted better health, we could have that.
mm,
If we wanted better education, we could have that. And if we wanted to tackle climate change, we could do that. It'd be quite easy. But because I'm not trying to sell fridges or oil and gas, that I don't need to confuse people and talk about GDP when we're just talking about democratic choices. What do we want more of? What do we want less of? That is what economics is about. The one of the first things we teach kids is about opportunity cost. That when you do something, when you consume resources to do one thing, you've lost the opportunity to do something else with those resources. So
yeah.
as a society, when we spend records amounts of money on things that we used to live without, then that's resources that can't be used to do something else with. Now, is that good or bad? Don't know. Is that right or wrong? Don't know. No, but these are individual choices,
Yeah.
and I take my training seriously. I don't know what's right and wrong, but I know that when we consume an enormous amount of resources subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, we have less resources to invest in health, education, or renewable energy. That's just a fact.
Yeah. It's a simple calculation, really.
Yeah, which is
Just
why we dress it up.
try to make it look fancy and make it harder for people to understand.
Yep.
Was there anything missing from your formal education that you feel like would have been helpful in what you do now, or that you've sort of had to grab from elsewhere and figure out along the way?
Oh God, yeah. But I mean, I was very lucky. I think I had a very good education at a small regional university. Nothing particularly glamorous or high status, but I had good lecturers. I had lots of face to face tutorials. I had lots of stimulating conversation. Um, and what I really learned was that there's no right answers to these things. And the most, I'm an economist. Everyone thinks that means I just make spreadsheets and play with models all day long. And there's some truth in that. It's a big part of my job. But, economics, once upon a time, economics was called moral philosophy. Adam Smith, the founder of economics, didn't call himself an economist. There was no such thing. It was just philosophers thinking about this new thing in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Like, oh, what is value? Where does it come from? Who should get the value that's produced from these new technologies and factories? And when you read a lot of economics, which luckily I was forced to do and actually really enjoyed, you read Karl Marx and you read John Maynard Keynes and you read Alfred Marshall and you read Joan Robinson and you read all these really smart people who disagree with each other. And you couldn't say any of them are stupid,
Mm,
but they clearly all looking at the same thing and finding different both bits that are interesting and different explanations. So really what I learned at uni was to beware simple answers, and to beware the arrogance of simple solutions. And yeah, with the holes in what I was taught, well, let me be clear, no undergraduate economics student in Australia would learn about economic models.
mm,
And the kind of stuff that you hear people all the time, new economic modeling shows, cutting taxes is good for poor people. I didn't learn anything about that at uni. But I was taught well enough that in my PhD, in my undergraduate, I didn't learn anything about it. In my PhD, I started to realize these models might be important. And I knew enough economics to teach myself about them, and that's really hopefully what a good degree is. And of course, other people helped me with that. I don't mean I sat alone in a cave, but I never sat through courses in how to build or critique the use of economic modelling, but I was taught enough economics and surrounded by enough supportive people to learn how to get to the bottom of things. And these days, that's the privilege of my job. I get to work with all sorts of experts in all sorts of fields, and good experts know that no one knows everything, and you've got to team up. And centrally to your topic, you got to know what the data means. And I think that's the biggest kind of problem with not just economic models, but a lot of what passes for research is people doing clever maths on databases they don't understand.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how good your statistical techniques are, how good your algorithm is. I love how we just use the word algorithm now instead of simple linear model. But it doesn't matter how clever you are. It doesn't matter how good you are at maths. It doesn't matter how good your algorithms, diagnostic stats look. If you don't really understand what the data is, how it was collected, the definitions, the categorizations, the limitations, if you don't understand that, you don't understand anything. And I
Fantastical quote. That's something that I really struggle to communicate in my teaching and building resources and stuff. The textbook, the sort of curriculum approach to data is, here is a data set, apply these stats to it. Whereas when I start with a data set, you always have to say, well, what is it? What do all the fields mean? How is it collected? How do the fields relate to each other? What is it? You have to have an understanding of the context and of the domain before you analyze the data. Otherwise, you could be coming up with things that just don't make any sense and that aren't valid.
Oh, happens all the time in economic public discourse about economics. So, for example, people think that the number of people that the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, describes as unemployed, people think that has something to do with the number of people who get unemployment benefits from the government. Now, the word unemployment is used in both of those phrases, but to be clear, they have nothing to do with each other. The Australian Bureau of Statistics does a survey of 30,000 households and asks people from some very specific questions, including, did you work for more than 1 hour last week? And if you work for more than 1 hour, you are defined as employed. And guess what? If you're employed, you can't be unemployed. Now, that's fine for the purpose for which ABS are collecting that data. But the Australian government will give unemployment benefits to people working 2 hours a week, getting $20 an hour with an income of $40 because no one thinks anyone can live on $40 a week. So we give what we think of as unemployment benefits to some people whose incomes are really low, unrelated to whether the Australian Bureau of Statistics would categorise that person as unemployed. Now, that's a clear example, but, they're everywhere. We talk about the cost of living, and we usually use something called the Consumer Price Index to track the cost of living. But if you went and read about the CPI, you'd see the Australian Bureau of Statistics say, please don't think the Consumer Price Index is a cost of living index. Here are reasons it's not. It doesn't include some important things, including mortgage interest rates, right? So it's not the Australian Bureau of Statistics' fault. Like, there's a hint where they say, warning, don't do this. And then people go and do it. People think that you can increase productivity by cutting people's wages or getting them to work longer hours. Well, that's not true. We measure productivity in terms of output per unit of input. How much stuff did you make per hour you were employed to make stuff? How much we pay you or underpay you, or how many of your wages we steal, that affects the profit your boss makes. Don't get me wrong, cutting people's wages is a great way to increase profit, but it doesn't change productivity at all, except it probably lowers it over time. because you can't attract and retain good workers. So, yeah, the public discourse about economics uses what sound like plain English words: unemployment, inflation, productivity, but the data has very precise technical meanings. And just to be crystal clear, smart people who do understand the definitions are used to confuse the hell out of people who don't. It is not an accident.
It's
It is
deliberate.
it is not an accident that people accidentally think that cutting people's wages is good for productivity
Mm.
when the economic definition of productivity is unrelated to how much exploitation there is of the workers.
Yeah. As that, so you've talked a lot about data in the context of economics and how it can be misused and misunderstood. Is there one thing that you think if everybody knew this, things would be different? People would, life would be better somehow because there's one thing about data that people now understand.
Oh, gee, that's hard. There's so
Mm.
many things I want to tell everybody are completely wrong. Um, uh, well, I think we've already covered one of the biggest, and that is that, and I'm paraphrasing here, the economists who invented gross domestic product, GDP, and keep in mind, we've got 7,000 years of recorded human history, and we've only collected GDP for 70 of them.
Mm.
Right? It's a new idea.
Yep.
Napoleon managed to conquer Europe without reference to GDP. The Egyptians managed to build the pyramids without GDP. Like it's a new idea. And to paraphrase, the people who invented it said, please don't ever use this as a measure of progress. Please, please, please don't do
Oh
that.
boy.
Please don't do that. What we've done is collected a way to collate an enormous amount of data that tells you how much stuff got bought and sold. But please, please, I beg of you, don't use it as a measure of progress. It is not the meaning of life. It's a number. And of course, most people's criticism of economics is that economists think GDP is the be all and end all. No, we don't. We're probably the people who best know what a silly number it is.
Mm.
Right? But it's not economists you're hearing from.
Yeah.
You're hearing from people who make profit selling you fridges. You're hearing from people who want a tax cut for themselves. You're hearing from people who want to cause climate change by selling more coal and gas, and they want to pretend that if they weren't selling more coal and gas, somehow that would be bad for you. So all the people saying GDP is the be all and end all, almost none of them are economists. And I don't think you'd find many academic economists or economists who aren't paid to think otherwise who would have any strong objection to the assertion that if we as a society focus too heavily on GDP, we will make bad decisions. Bad decisions.
There was a talk I saw, I think it was a TED talk from a New Zealand economist she pointed out that war is actually great for the GDP.
Oh, yeah. Was that Marilyn Waring?
Yes, it
Ah,
was.
look, I owe an enormous intellectual debt to Marilyn Waring. She's one of the most influential economists in the world, and her work on the limitations of GDP did certainly change the way I understood what the data meant, but transformed the world in the way that it understood what the data meant. And she's written, so I mean, war is kind of perfect for boosting GDP, especially in the short term, because think about it. The things that we're producing don't just blow up and need replacing. They blow up other things that need
Yeah.
replacing. And now, so what that means is if all you're measuring is how much activity there is making stuff,
Mm.
right, and that's what GDP does, it measures
Yeah.
how much stuff got bought and sold in a particular period. War is great in the short term. Right? It's actually terrible in the long term because
Mm.
not only do we traumatize, well, we kill people, we traumatize whole populations, and without bridges and without roads and without factories, it gets harder over time to make stuff.
Yeah.
But in the short term, Oh no, it's quite good. There was a big boost in GDP in Japan after the Kobe earthquake, right? Because
Yeah.
all that stuff needed rebuilding.
Yeah.
So, to get slightly technical, GDP measures the flow, the change in stuff that was made this year, when what really affects our livelihoods is the level, the amount of stuff we've got. So if the stuff we've got accumulates over time, we've got better infrastructure, we've got we've all bought all of our appliances and they last 100 years. We've bought all our furniture and it lasts 100 years. Like if we were always getting new stuff, GDP might show us how things are getting better. But if we've been trained to throw out our couch and buy a new one every 3 years, then we're not, we have slightly more modernish furniture, but we're not really any better off. So
Yeah.
yeah, war. Unfortunately, I don't mean to trivialize it. The consequences are catastrophic beyond the economic, but even
Yeah.
within the economic, they're bad eventually. There's a great old skit of Charlie Chaplin. And he's walking along and he's chucking rocks through windows, and then his dad walks past offering to sell new windows.
Yeah.
Right, great for the economy,
Hmm.
great for the economy. But is that the society we want to live in?
Yeah. Well,
You
I
know,
mean, it is the society we live in, I think, in many ways, but
well, that's our choice. Let's be clear.
yeah.
Let's be grown ups. Let's have agency. Like
Yep.
that's what we've chosen to do in Australia in 2022. It's
Mm,
not what we did in 1950. It's not what we
mm,
did in 1960. It's not what most of the people around the world do today. So it's not traditional or customary to live this bizarre life.
yeah.
Right? This is a new idea. So again, let's have agency. If we wanted to change it, we could. If we're happy with it, we shouldn't. And I've said there's a reason for this. People have been selling this bad idea to us, but everyone listening's heard that now. It's up to them who to decide who they want to trust. But let's not pretend it has to be this way.
It's interesting. There's a thread through what you've been talking about several times. You've talked about so you talked about Marilyn Waring changing your understanding of the data and of different interpretations of the data and different people taking different messages from the data, and also that idea that you said earlier about beware of simple solutions and simple kind of interpretations. And I think they come together beautifully, because one of the things that we often see is someone holds up some data and says the data shows absolutely 100% that this is the best way to go, or this is the thing we have to do, or coming up with an interpretation of the data is seen as a mathematical result
Mm.
too often, where it's not. It's an interpretation of the maths maybe, but you can actually, one of the things I like to teach kids is to find different interpretations so that they understand that the first answer they get is not necessarily the right answer, and they have to actually keep interrogating the data and figure out, well, are there other explanations for the thing you think you found.
Yeah.
It would be nice to see that in a government business sense, and in the media, to actually have that recognition that, well, it's not it's not soundbite simple.
No, and look, I don't get me wrong. I accept your premise. I agree, but I think it's kind of worse than that, because there are simple bits of data that, while still having interpretation, have kind of clear meaning. And
Mm,
I take, for example, we've been told for decades, if we keep putting CO2 into the atmosphere, we
yep.
are almost certainly, and I say almost asterisk, 99.99, but let's be clear, almost certain this is going to happen, and that we really should reduce it. And in the last 20 years, there's been and I think this sounds grandiose, but there's been a unique attack on kind of the whole idea, the Enlightenment idea of kind of Western democracy, because there's been this enormous attack on data, on
Yeah.
science. And in order to protect the profits of the oil and gas and coal industry, corporate, the corporate sector around the world was actually willing to have a fight with science.
Yeah.
And I don't mean a skirmish. I mean a head-on fight where the fight was to convince the public, don't trust the data, don't trust the science. So on the one hand, I agree with you entirely. We should always doubt. We should always think, all right, what is this? Where is the data coming from? What does it mean? We should do that. And I agree with you 100% that we need to encourage people to do that. But we also need to be aware that we're now asking people to do that in a world where I think I saw 8% of Americans report believing that lizard people are, running the world.
Wow.
Exactly. Now, even if that's half of them are just, mocking the survey questionnaire, you know,
Yep.
so we've been told that we can't trust the CSIRO, we can't trust NASA, we can't trust
Yeah.
any of those institutions around which we used to debate the policy implications, but we weren't told don't trust the entire scientific community. So I don't know how we back our semi-trailer out of that cul-de-sac, because we do have to be skeptical, we do have to
Yep.
ask questions, but do the research has become a catch cry for people who don't do any research. you
Well,
know
what they look. It's basically confirmation bias. They look for the things that confirm their point of view, and so the challenge is to teach rational skepticism rather than skepticism on the basis of what some dude said on YouTube, and that's
yeah.
again, that comes back to the way we teach and um, and I guess the way we think about things. Um, is there is there like one single data mistake where you'd go, and I'm talking mistakes rather than deliberate misuse, which we'll get to in a minute, but is there one single data mistake that you think is kind of that tops them all? Do you have a favorite or
Oh,
most
well,
horrific?
yeah, for an Australian audience, look, there's so many, but the Morrison government, former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, said that he delivered a balanced budget. Right? He delivered a balanced budget, which all that means is the amount of revenue and the amount of spending were the same.
Hmm.
And he didn't. He didn't. And he knows he didn't. And every economist knows he didn't. What he did was deliver a piece of paper. He put a piece of paper on a table that projected that that the revenue and the spending would be equal. Right? So he put a forecast on a table and said, today I forecast that good things might happen.
Uh-huh.
And they didn't happen. Everyone knows they didn't happen. There was no balanced budget. There was an enormous deficit. But he says that because he put the piece of paper on the table with the forecast in it, that he delivered a balanced budget. Right? The budget was not balanced. Let's
Yep.
be clear.
Yep.
Spending was much greater than revenue. And is that a lie, or is that just an outrageous attempt to confuse people about the word deliver and the word budget and the word balance? So I choose that because it kind of just shows that when people want to mislead you and they want to deceive you, uh, our structures don't work.
Yeah.
Like actually trust is built in to the idea, and there's the idea of gilding the lily or putting a positive spin on something, but just flat out misleading people and telling them black is white and staring them in the face and using the power of office to get away with it. That's why people lose faith in not just economics, they probably never had any, but increasingly with democracy. So that sticks out, but that was another cynical one. Look, yeah, the number of times I've heard people say, as I said before, look, the ABS says that unemployment's falling, but the number of people on welfare is rising, so they must all be welfare cheats.
Also forward.
And it's like, yeah, or you're an idiot who talks before they research, who grabs a number and thinks they know what a number means, and then is so full of self-confidence that you just rush out and provide commentary on a number you don't even understand.
Yeah.
And perhaps because you've heard other people make similarly dumb things, not people with independent expertise, but just other powerful people. So yeah, we unfortunately get this kind of echo chamber of misunderstanding. We at the Australia Institute, every now and then we do a survey and we ask people, what percentage of people do you think work in the mining industry, for example? And most people, there's no right answer, of course. It's what do you think? And most people think it's kind of 10 or 20%. It's 2. All right. And
Really?
yeah, so that's okay. They're only out by a factor of 10. All right. But if the newspapers are full of how important the mining industry is,
Yeah.
you can't blame people for thinking, oh, I guess they must be pretty big and important. In Tasmania, we asked the Tasmanians, there's been fights about native forest logging in Tasmania my whole life. We've asked people in Tasmania, what percentage of people in Tasmania work in native forest logging? The average Tasmanian thinks around, or thought last time we did the survey, around 20% of people work in forestry. It's less than 1.
Wow.
Right? But again, that doesn't mean people are stupid. It means that actually, because of the media they consume, because of the political debate they consume, they think, well, you couldn't have a fight that big about something that small. So, you have to be careful who to blame when you have misunderstanding. Now, it's not top secret. Anyone can go to the Australian Bureau of Statistics website and find out what employment in forestry is in Tasmania. It doesn't take a lot of economic analysis. It just takes a bit of navigation of a statistical website. But let's be clear, most journalists don't do that. Most politicians don't do that. Most people don't do that. So these outrageous lies or mistruths or misunderstandings can perpetuate for decades.
Are there any sort of tells that you use to, or that you could tell people to use to spot the really egregious misrepresentations of economics in the media and stuff?
Yeah, look, it's so obvious that it's probably impossible to spot. You just have to think, who benefits from this?
Mm.
People, high income earners demanding tax cuts. Okay, yeah. Big business demanding tax cuts. Interesting. Employers saying workers need lower wages. Yeah, I reckon I can get to a lot of these conclusions without knowing any economics.
Yeah.
Right? But they use a lot of economics to get to the same conclusion. Look at my 200-page report that as luck would have it, with lots of graphs, shows exactly what I've been saying is good for me all along, turns out is good for you. So, look, yeah, the main tell is a lot of, I call it econobabble, but a lot of fancy words that are concealing the obvious self-interest of the position being advocated. Now if someone would say, all right, well, Richard, what's your self-interest? You're just a this, or well, whatever. I don't know. I work at a not-for-profit. So there's a hint. At the end of the day, we get to go home and not make a profit. Right? Now, but do I bring who I am and my perceptions and my biases? Yeah, no problem. But I don't get rich out of saying I'm happy to pay more tax.
Yeah.
So you can people can disagree with me, right? That's fine. And I can say, well, the highest tax countries in the world are the richest countries in the world: Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland. It's all top secret data hidden. There's this well-known left-wing institution called the International Monetary Fund, and anyone that wants to check my facts can go to the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or the OECD or all those other leftist
Those notorious
institutions.
socialists.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, facts have a well-known left-wing bias. But the fact that Norway, Denmark, Sweden are high tax, rich, happy, with great health, great education, this is not top secret,
Yep.
right? So that's available to anyone that wants to look. So if I, sitting here in Australia, say, well, I'm happy to pay more tax and I'm happy for us to spend more money on services, is that me bringing my bias to it? Well, I don't know. I've looked at the data and I'm persuaded by it, but I'm not any better off if I pay more tax and spend more money on your health. But if I get put on media, it's left wing think tank, the Australian Institute says, but we don't call the Business Council of Australia right wing.
Yeah.
We don't say that when the CEO of a bank goes on and tells us what's good for the banks. We don't say right wing bank. So yeah, it's hard to have an open debate in Australia, but we try. All good.
It's like all those people who say, oh, people who argue that climate change is a thing are just trying to cash in on the climate
Oh
change
yeah,
train.
the industry. Yeah.
Do you know how research works? Have you looked at the budgets those scientists are working under? I don't think you're.
World's most profitable industry accuses scientists of being being in academia for the cash. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So unfortunately, yeah. I mean, so look, really big claims that seem to justify self-interest in the name of national interest
Yeah,
I think that's the biggest tell.
that's
Not,
flag.
if you give me what I want, GDP will rise $50 billion. Yeah, maybe. It's just funny that you get what you want first,
Yeah,
and then maybe we'll all get some benefits later. Interesting.
yeah. Who could have thought?
Yeah.
What's the first thing that you think, or the first question that you ask when you look at graphs and data that are presented in the media? What's your sort of go-to question?
Oh well, sounds odd. The first thing I think of is, where did the data come from? Like, what is this data? What graph am I actually looking at?
Yeah,
So to do that, I guess I literally read the heading carefully, because hopefully that tells me kind of what the data is. And then I look at the source and think, okay, is this Australian Bureau of Statistics, or is this someone's survey of their membership, for example? So it sounds odd, especially because, this is the entire topic of this podcast. But yeah, what is the data, and is it high quality data, is literally the first thing I think about. And then I sort of think, all right, what's going on here? Are they telling me something that's happening over time? If so, what's the time period that's been chosen here? And, if I have some context, I think, I know we've got 50 years of data for that. Seems odd they've focused on 5, or, okay, we're comparing Australia to 3 or 4 other countries. I know there's 194 countries. I wonder why we picked those ones. So yeah, usually especially in the media, a graph is being used to present some form of context, change over time, level between countries or states or regions, or so I kind of always just think, all right, well, what would the whole data set look like? What's been excluded from the graph before I kind of tune into what is in the graph. And of course, I don't know everything about every data set. So depending on how interested I am in the graph, I'd pick up the phone and ring someone and say, hey, this graph looks really interesting, but I don't know what I don't know, so find someone that does know the data would be my second port of call.
Yeah. Ask an expert. That's not very
old school, huh? Yeah, or go and look it up myself. But luckily, I'm of an age where I've done a lot of research with a lot of people, and I know people who know things.
Yeah.
And that's, for any researchers listening, it's an invaluable resource that can only be accumulated over time. And I
Mm.
would say to early career researchers, this is why you want to collaborate with people, because they'll always know different things than you do. And if you're a good collaborator, if you play nicely with people, no, your life just gets better and more interesting, because for the rest of your life, when you ring people and ask them questions, they won't think, oh, you're that annoying person that never helps me but always wants me to help them.
Yeah.
So having a network of people who, even if they're not experts themselves, who know who other experts are, I think is an invaluable skill if you want to do research that, if you're, well, certainly if you're interested in kind of broad policy issues, because
Mm.
I know what I do know. That's the good thing about doing a PhD. It's a good thing about accumulating expertise, outside of a uni. There are people who've drilled all the way to the bottom in some data sets, and when you've gone all the way to the bottom of any data set, you're always scared dealing with any other data set,
Yeah.
because you know what you don't know. Like, it's just
Yeah.
instinct. You think, no, there are a small number of things that I will put my hand on my heart and say, I know exactly what these numbers mean,
Mm.
but you also remember how long it took you to get to that point.
Yeah.
So I think having some humility about how few data sets that any human really, really knows, hopefully just makes it instinct to reach out to other people, including often the people that publish the data, who
Yep.
are often, they're sitting there wondering why people criticize them when no one rang. you know,
Yep.
if you had a rung and asked why we chose that time period, I'd have told you,
Mm.
So, yeah, contact the author. How's that for old fashioned advice?
I love that. I've found too that people are very generous with their time and expertise if they possibly can be, and very happy to help you understand their work.
Yeah.
I
Well,
think
good
that's
researchers want that to happen.
yeah.
I get a lot of emails. I'm busy, but when someone reaches out to say, how did you do this, or where did this come from? Like, why wouldn't you want to answer that? And
Yeah.
and don't get me wrong. Sometimes people are just being lazy, and you do feel like saying Google it. So
Mm.
to critique my own advice, if you're gonna no, but if you're gonna reach out to an author, make sure you've actually read their report first. Make sure
Yep.
you've actually had a think about it first. And
Yep.
if there's something there that you can't figure out, then you should reach out. Absolutely. But yeah, don't just send the email before you've done your own bit. But yeah, as I said, myself and most researchers I know, they think that's a good thing.
Yeah. I love that, and I think that concept that you need to surround yourself by people who know stuff, and it's like that advice, never, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Yeah.
And that humility to know what you don't know, and to be comfortable reaching out to people, and building those networks of people who get it. I also think a lot of the interesting problems are on the boundaries of disciplines, uh, deal with the interconnection of things rather than being uniquely in one particular area.
Oh, absolutely. And in turn, that as debates evolve, or as policies change, data sets that used to be fit for purpose can cease to be.
Yeah.
And that's kind of no one's fault. But unless you're, again, engaging with other people, I'll give you a good example. I said before, if you work for more than 1 hour a week, you're defined as employed by the Australian Bureau of Statistics.
Hmm.
That allows them to calculate the number of employed people, no problem at all. And we've been collecting data using the same questionnaire effectively for over 50 years, which is wonderful because we've got a nice time series, and everyone loves a nice time series. But back in the 1970s, when you asked people, did you work more than 1 hour a week? I'll make up a number here, don't quote me on this, but let's say 90% of people who said yes probably worked full time,
Yeah.
right? Working more than 1 hour a week used to be a proxy for having a full time job.
Hmm.
But today, That's radically different. I'll say 50%, but it'll be lower. So please, this is a data podcast. I don't have any data in front of me. I'm giving you orders of magnitude. So the questionnaire hasn't changed.
Yeah.
The limitations of the question are still the same.
Yeah.
But the society of which those limitations were agreed to has changed radically.
Yeah.
And people in the 60s and 70s weren't stupid. When they decided, we'll ask people, are they working more than 1 hour a week? They knew there were some people that would only be working 2, right? But at the time, they thought, okay, that's fine. That's a trivial percentage of the population. It doesn't have much economic significance. It doesn't have much social significance. We're going to do it this way. But the society that we live in now is radically different from the society that said that question was good enough.
Yeah.
So yeah, has the data quality changed over the passage of 50 years? Well, depends on your definition of quality, doesn't it? Because the sample is probably more accurate than it used to be. But the meaningfulness of
Context
the
is so different.
data is radically different. And just to say it in a loud voice, unless in case it's implicit, that it was a bunch of blokes dominating the way we collected data in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s who weren't terribly aware of or interested in or concerned by the employment conditions that mainly affected women, part-time, casual, sporadic work, right? And the decisions they made about how to collect and organize the data are casting a long shadow today. And back to Marilyn Waring, a lot of her work was about how GDP, gross domestic product, so there's a hint there, product, stuff that's produced, focuses on forms of production that take place within the market economy, not production that takes place within the household economy.
Yeah.
And apparently a whole bunch of blokes in the 50s and 60s and 70s thought that was fine. Well, I think if you were inventing GDP today and you said, how about we underestimate the significance of women's production? How about we underestimate the significance of the work patterns typically either chosen by women or imposed on women? How about that's what our data set looks like? I think a few people would say, hey, slow down there, big boy. I see the simplicity of what you're proposing, but there's some consequences. But because we made these decisions decades ago, and because people love a long time series, the status quo is imperfect, but at least it's agreed. And if I came out tomorrow and said, what if we did it differently? I'd have to fight 50 other people who had other different ideas. And at the end of the fight, you know what we do? What we do now.
Yeah.
So we're kind of stuck with GDP and we're stuck with the way we measure the labour market, not because any actual economists who know the data think it's perfect, but because any alternative to it would have to grapple with the same problems, and there's no right way to grapple with them, and you can't get consensus for a new grappling, so we stay with what we all know is wrong.
So it's a social and political problem rather than a technical or mathematical problem. Or
Let me be clear, it's a social and political problem, not an economic or technocratic problem. Absolutely. You are 100% right. But it sounds like economics.
Yes.
And because it sounds like economics, we kind of leave it to either the economists or more usually people who sound like they understand economics to participate in these debates on our behalf.
And numbers are objective, right? You're measuring things, so it's all objective.
I should have said this earlier, but here's the tell. Here's the tell. When you want to know someone is really talking crap, in economics, when someone's making a projection over any 3 years, 30 years in the future, the minute you hear a decimal place, they're making crap up.
Yeah.
We are guessing about these things. Now, hopefully, our guesses are based on some data and some experience and some theory, and done well, our guesses might be better than average. But when we're putting decimal places into our guesses, that's because we think you will confuse precision with accuracy. Right? We think if we say, economic growth will be 3.75%, not 3.8, not
Yeah.
3.7, 3.75% in 2 years' time, you'll think, oh yeah, okay, they really know their stuff. No,
Yeah.
no, we've got no idea. But that second decimal place is for symbolic purposes. And unfortunately, that's why people, are losing faith in my profession.
That's a disturbing kind of angle to finish on. So I'm gonna ask a better question. What excites you about data?
That we can learn things. That I can learn things. That I can see patterns that I didn't know were there. I can see relationships that I didn't know were there. That problems that seemed unsolvable might be able to be solved either with new data sets, new tools of analysis, or, and here's the fun one, new perspectives, right? Actually, fresh eyes looking at old data and looking at old techniques often just say, "What are you doing them that way for?" And that's exciting. That's yeah, that's why we do it. That's those poor old people, mainly men, walking along the beach with their metal detectors, thinking there's got to be some gold under the sand. I mean, that's what research is, and hopefully, you're kind of doing that in fertile terrain, and hopefully you find interesting things. But if you know what you're going to find, you're not really doing research. So yeah, it's exciting.
I want that on a t-shirt. That sums it up, doesn't it? That's the number of times I see a scientific paper that says the object of this study was to prove that or to show that. And I'm like, no, no, that's not science. If you know what you're going to find, it's not research. Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely going to make some
yes.
t-shirts of that.
So no, look, I think that and also for me, escapee from academia, working at a think tank, when you can collect data, new data, or analyze data, and you can show it to people, and you can see that it changes people's minds. You
Mm,
can see that it affects a public debate, that you can see that parliamentarians vote differently because of it.
mm.
That's exciting and humbling at the same time. So yeah, no, data matters, and we need data, but we need to read the heading and the sources, and, and call the authors and do the boring stuff too, because it's important. And if it's important, it's worth finding out about.
Magnificent. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you, and sincerely, thank you for making the podcast. We need people to think about these sort of issues.
We really do. Thanks for listening to Make Me Data Literate. You can support the work of the Australian Data Science Education Institute at givenow.com.au/ADSEI. Tune in next time for more conversations with amazing data experts.